When it comes to doctors, it's absolutely terrifying to think that not all of them have your best interest at heart, and it's even scarier to think that some might be out to kill you. Welcome back to Most Amazing Friends. I am your host Kennedy, and today we are going under the knife as we count down the top 10 longest prison sentences given to doctors. Let's get started. Coming in at number 10, Christopher Duntsch. Once upon a time, Christopher dreamed of tackling a career in football. However, despite an appetite for the game, he lacked the talent to pursue it professionally and eventually decided to switch to a career in medicine. By 1995, he completed his undergraduate, and so next he shot into the prestigious MD-PhD program, completing it in 2010. However, despite all this heavy-duty training, colleagues began to notice that something just wasn't quite right about him. Some believed he was under the influence at certain times, and others blatantly confessed they would never let him operate on them. Still, looking good on paper, Christopher managed to get a job as a spinal surgeon. Not long after, a trail of bad news began to follow him. Patients were suffering strange complications from his operations, one almost dying from infection, another had a surgical sponge left inside, and colleagues began noticing that he would regularly misdiagnose patients or even perform unnecessary surgeries. Thankfully, his evil habits caught up quickly, and by 2013, the Texas Medical Board revoked his license before a major lawsuit began the following year. As it turns out, during his residency, he performed fewer than 100 surgeries compared to the usual 1,000 or more, and this lack of expertise eventually killed 2 people, paralyzed another 2, and injured countless others. But what's even sicker about all of this is that he wasn't just some clueless idiot. In a 2011 email used against him in court, he allegedly said, quote, "I am ready to leave the love and kindness and goodness and patience that I mix with everything else that I am and become a cold-blooded killer." So with the blood of 33 patients on his hands, Dr. Duntsch was sentenced to life in prison for the maiming and injuries caused to his patients. Next up at number 9, Jayant Patel. The Doctor of Death, as coined by the media, Patel worked in both the USA and Australia and is believed to be responsible for the death of as many as 87 patients between 2003 to 2005. Trouble began following Patel as early as 1984, after he was fined $5,000 and suspended for 3 years for failing to properly examine a patient before surgery. Then fast forward a few years to 1995, and Patel was once again in hot water after colleagues began complaining that he would perform surgery when not rostered to work, would operate on other surgeons' patients, and was routinely causing serious injury and even death. Because of this, his hospital began restricting what surgeries he was allowed to perform, and so likely trying to get away with his evil deeds, Patel transferred to an Australian hospital in 2003, where he somehow managed to become a director of surgery despite his lack of qualifications. However, the staff at this new hospital caught on quick to his incompetence and would hide patients from him in fear that he would hurt them. Finally, in 2010, he was found guilty and sentenced to 7 years behind bars, as well as being barred from practicing medicine ever again. Next up at number 8, Jack Kevorkian. During the mid to late 90s, Dr. Jack Kevorkian became a notorious figure in the media after becoming a champion for a terminally ill patient's right to die, despite the laws that prohibited it at the time. Now, compared to others on this list, he's definitely in a much grayer area, but even so, by 1999, he was convicted of second-degree homicide for his role in the voluntary euthanasia of over 130 patients. However, that wasn't where all the controversy began. Earlier in his career, he fell under similar criticism after proposing that medical experiments be performed on death row inmates who choose to do so, arguing in his 1959 paper that they could provide a service to humanity prior to their inevitable fate. He garnered very little support for his ideas, and by 1980 he shifted focus to the ethics of euthanasia. By 1987 he started advertising his services as a death consultant, and by 1989 his first patient, Janet Adkins, sought out his services. After the assisted death became public, they were not initially able to charge him as there were no laws surrounding euthanasia. However, Jack's medical license was revoked. Despite this, he continued his services for the terminally ill and was eventually arrested in 1998. Through the trial, his reputation earned him the nickname Dr. Death, and he ended up being sentenced to 10 to 25 years for his deeds. However, despite the negative narrative, the doctor always fought back, claiming to be aiding the terminally ill and their lives on their own terms, and famously once said, quote, "Dying is not a crime." Coming in at number 7, Morris Bolber. Nicknamed Dr. Mob due to his affiliations with the infamous group, Bolber was a physician in the 1930s who became notorious for his involvement with the Philadelphia poison ring. It all started with Italian cousins Herman Petrillo, a counterfeiter and arsonist, and Paul Petrillo, an insurance scammer who ran a business out of his tailor shop. By 1931, the insurance scam killings began taking place, and hired thugs would track down their victims, ending their lives in brutal ways so the cousins could claim the life insurance. Soon, Dr. Morris, who prescribed to La Futura magic and was known to provide his patients with strange potions, became involved in the operation, and he and the cousins began preying on unhappy, gullible, or sometimes even villainous housewives, issuing them love potions that would either cure their abusive husbands or potentially, wink wink, kill them if they were irredeemable. At least that was the company line. In reality, there was no love potion at all, rather expensive vials of arsenic accompanied by excessive insurance policies that favored the gang over the soon-to-be widow. Eventually in 1939, the jig was up, and after being involved with the death of 30 to 50 people, Dr. Mob was arrested and offered up evidence against the cousins in exchange for a life sentence instead of the death penalty. Coming in at number 6, Linda Hazzard. Unlike the others on this list, Dr. Linda Hazzard was not a medical doctor, but instead a woman who managed to receive a license to practice medicine through a loophole that grandfathered practitioners of alternative medicine. Author of the books Fasting for the Cure of Disease, Diet in Disease and Systemic Cleansing, and Scientific Fasting, the Ancient and Modern Key to Health, Hazzard believed that all illnesses were the result of excessive eating, and that literally any disease could be cured with enough restriction. With her belief in mind, Hazzard went on to develop a specialized hospital where she would force patients to fast for weeks or even months, providing them only occasional and small amounts of tomato, asparagus, or orange juice. But that wasn't all. On top of starving her patients, Hazzard also prescribed daily enemas, and patients were often beaten by the staff. Over the years, 40 patients died from her treatment, but it wasn't until 1912 when Dr. Linda was finally convicted of manslaughter after it was discovered she forged a patient's will who died at a staggering 50 pounds and made herself the beneficiary. The quack was sentenced to 20 years, but was mysteriously pardoned 2 years later and eventually died from her own program of starvation. Coming in at number 5, Hu Wanlin. Born in 1949, Hu Wanlin only ever received a primary school education and tragically began getting in trouble with the law very early on. Already a convicted felon, Hu was actually in prison serving 15 years for killing a businessman as well as trafficking young women, and shockingly, it was while he was behind bars that he began practicing medicine. In 1993, Wanlin began posing as a doctor specializing in ancient Chinese medicine and managed to open a practice from prison where he would prescribe herbal treatments that were actually fatal amounts of sodium sulfate advertised as medical miracles. Then in 1997, he was released from custody and, despite having no legal certification, continued on with his miracle medicine practice. However, by 1999, he was once again arrested on the suspicion of causing nearly 150 deaths, found guilty of illegally practicing medicine, and sentenced to 15 years behind bars. Next up at number 4, Harold Shipman. Nicknamed the Angel of Death, Harold Shipman is not only a terrifying doctor with a prolific history, but is also one of the most infamous killers in British history. Born in 1940, 1946, in his youth, Shipman was very close to his mother, but sadly she suffered from lung cancer and died in 1963 when Shipman was just 17. Now, it's likely that this death had something to do with his later decisions in life, as after her death he enrolled in medical school, graduating in 1970. Soon after his graduation, he began working in the field, and by 1974, Shipman began working as a GP, and that is when things began to go south. Shipman began discreetly killing elderly patients and managed to slide under the radar for many years, but by 1998, other doctors around began to notice the high death rate among his patients and became quite concerned that some malpractice might be at play. An investigation began, and eventually they discovered he had been responsible for the death of an estimated 250 of his patients, each with a forged death certificate stating they died of old age, and some even with forged wills. In reality, Shipman had been purposefully overdosing elderly women, mirroring the last few days of his mother's life, and for his crimes he was sentenced to life. Coming in at number 3, Maxim Petrov. Between the years of 1999 and 2000, Maxim Petrov was a physician responsible for the death of 11 people. Initially, he started out with home invasions. He would go to patients' houses on strange, unannounced home visits, measure their blood pressure, and suggest they needed an injection. Petrov would then quickly administer just enough medication to make them pass out, but not enough to actually kill them, and promptly rob their homes. However, it all took a turn on his 13th robbery when the daughter of the anesthetized patient returned home mid-robbery, and Petrov immediately stabbed the crime-witnessing daughter and then strangled the knocked-out patient. From there on out, it seems like he decided to change his motives and would use a lethal mix of a variety of different to take the victims' lives rather than just put them to sleep, purposefully using a variety of in an attempt to throw off police from him having any medical knowledge. He would rob the houses, then set them on fire to destroy the evidence. But authorities eventually found the link between all the victims. They were all lung patients on the same list, and later when Petrov went to visit another of the patients on that list, officers arrested him and he admitted to his wrongdoings. Initially suspected of committing 19 killings, he was only confirmed with 11, but still sentenced to life in prison, where he remains to this day. Coming in at number 2, Michael Swango. When it comes to creepy doctors, this guy might just take the cake. After graduating high school in 1972, Swango enrolled in the Marine Corps. However, by 1980, not long after he joined, he was honorably discharged and decided to head to medical school instead. His creepy behavior started early on. While in school, although a bright student, he preferred to work as an ambulance attendant and was described as having a strange fascination with dying patients. In fact, although no one put the pieces together until later, many of his assigned patients mysteriously ended up coding, at least 5 of whom actually died. Next, he managed to get into an internship at Ohio State University, but it didn't take long before nurses began feeling that something was deeply wrong with him. Patients that seemed perfectly fine were suddenly dying while under his care, and one nurse even witnessed him administering a strange needle despite that the patient's chart didn't require it. Eventually, the internship ended and he moved to Illinois and began working as an EMT. This time around, he began not only hurting patients, but his colleagues, administering poison into the food he would bring into work. Now, here's where it gets insane. He was actually arrested for battery following the poisoning of fellow EMTs and went to prison for 5 years. After his release, however, knowing he would not be able to practice medicine, he legally changed his name and began forging his way into hospitals. Once someone found out the truth, he would move, and this goose chase eventually sent him out of the country to Zimbabwe. Thankfully, the FBI caught up to him arresting him in 1997 for his multiple felonies, and this monster, responsible for the death of an estimated 60 patients, was sentenced to life behind bars. And last up today in our number 1 spot, Herta Oberheuser. We all know that during World War II, there were hundreds of so-called physicians performing unspeakable experiments on prisoners of the death camps under the guise of medicine, and one of these horrible monsters was Herta Oberheuser. In 1937, Dr. Oberheuser obtained her medical degree and soon joined the infamous German Party, becoming a doctor for the League of German Girls. By 1940, she became the assistant to Karl Gerhard, chief surgeon of the party, as well as the personal physician of Heinrich Himmler. However, her biggest atrocities on humankind came in 1942, when she began working at a woman's only death camp conducting experiments on its prisoners under the guise of finding better methods to treat infection. Her experiments, however, were far from real medicine. She would deliberately wound her victims before contaminating the open wound with bacteria, sometimes even sticking rusty nails, sawdust, or bits of broken glass into the affected area. From there, Oberheuser would watch as the women writhed in agony, observing the effects until their death became imminent, at which point she would kill them with an injection of gasoline or another substance, causing them an agonizing death that took about 5 minutes to complete. Finally, once they were dead, she would dissect the bodies for further experimentation. Now, what is insane about this doctor is that despite being a part of the doctor's trials once the war was over, she was merely sentenced to 20 years compared to some of her colleagues who faced life. Even more insane is that she was released early for good behavior and actually attempted to open a practice after her release. Thank God, protesters forced to close, and in 1958 her medical license was finally revoked. Well, there you have it, folks. I hope you liked this video. If you did, make sure to hit that subscribe button, and I will see you next time.